You're standing on a windswept beach in Northumbria, and the sand beneath your feet is stained red. Not from yesterday's tide. From blood that seeped into the earth 8 centuries ago and never quite washed away. The monastery behind you is burning, but that's not the worst part. The worst part is the silence. 73 women lived here yesterday. This morning, only their screams remain, echoing off stone walls that were supposed to protect them. By nightfall, they'll be gone, loaded into dragon-proud ships like cargo, sailing toward a fate the Church will spend the next 1,000 years trying to erase from history. What the Vikings did to these women, to Christian nuns who'd devoted their lives to God, wasn't just brutality. It was a calculated dismantling of everything medieval Europe believed about holiness, protection, and divine justice. If you're captivated by these untold chapters of the past, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I'm constantly amazed by how many of us, scattered across continents, share this hunger to understand what really happened in the shadows of history. Now, let's walk back through time to the moment before everything shattered. The year is 793, and the monastery of Lindisfarne sits on a tidal island off England's northeastern coast. It's more than a religious house. It's a symbol. For 2 centuries, this place has represented the triumph of Christianity over pagan Britain, a beacon of learning and sanctity in a world still crawling out of the Dark Ages. The Venerable Bede himself chronicled its founding. Kings have endowed it with land and treasure. Pilgrims journey here to pray at shrines built over the bones of saints. And within its walls, behind the men's monastery, sits the women's convent, home to 73 nuns who believed their vows made them untouchable. They were wrong. The historical record of what happened at Lindisfarne exists in fragments, carefully edited by monks who survived to write about it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the raid in clinical language. The ravaging of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. Alcuin of York, advisor to Charlemagne, wrote letters expressing horror that such a sacred place could be violated. But these accounts focus almost entirely on the destruction of buildings, the theft of treasures, the deaths of monks. The women vanish from the narrative after a single line. Many were taken captive. Taken where? For what purpose? The sources go silent. For 1,200 years, historians assumed the nuns of Lindisfarne died in the raid or shortly after. Martyrs for the faith. Names to be remembered in prayer books and forgotten everywhere else. But archaeological evidence from Scandinavian settlements, combined with later Viking Age legal codes and slave market records, tells a different story. The women didn't die quickly. They were transported across the North Sea to Norway, absorbed into a system of captivity so comprehensive, so carefully structured, that it sustained Viking expansion for the next 2 centuries. What happened to them wasn't random violence. It was economic strategy, psychological warfare, and something darker still, the deliberate targeting of women whose bodies represented everything Christianity claimed to hold sacred. The scale of Viking raids on monastic communities has been systematically underestimated by traditional histories, partly because the Church itself had reasons to minimize the extent of the catastrophe. Between 793 and 850, more than 40 documented raids struck monasteries along the British and Irish coasts. Lindisfarne was first, but Jarrow, Monkwearmouth, Iona, and dozens of smaller houses followed. Each raid followed a similar pattern. Strike at dawn, overwhelm defenders before organized resistance could form, seize portable wealth, and, most importantly, seize people. The Vikings weren't just raiders. They were slavers operating on an industrial scale. Estimates based on fragmentary sources suggest that over those 50 years, more than 2,000 religious men and women were taken from Britain and Ireland alone. The men, monks, and priests were valuable as ransom material or skilled labor. Many were eventually sold in markets as far east as Constantinople, where their literacy made them prized possessions. But the women presented a different kind of value. In Viking Age Scandinavian society, the acquisition of foreign women, particularly high-status women, served multiple functions. They were labor, certainly, working in settlements that desperately needed hands to prepare for brutal winters. But they were also symbols. A jarl who possessed Christian nuns had demonstrated his power over the Christian god himself. He'd stolen what their deity couldn't protect. And in a culture where honor and reputation determined political standing, that mattered more than gold. The nuns taken from Lindisfarne weren't randomly seized. The raid was organized with precision that suggests advanced planning. Ships had been watching the coast for weeks. The timing of the attack, June 8th by the Chronicles' reckoning, coincided with the period when the monastery's male defenders were at their weakest, many away at summer labor in fields along the mainland. The raiders knew the layout. They went straight to the women's quarters. They separated the nuns into groups, the young and strong loaded immediately onto ships, the old and infirm left behind or killed outright when they couldn't keep pace. This wasn't chaos. It was selection. The voyage north took anywhere from 5 days to 2 weeks depending on wind and weather. The women were kept below decks in spaces designed for cargo, not human transport. Ship timbers recovered from Norse burial sites show wear patterns consistent with chains and restraints, grooves worn into wood from iron links dragged across planks season after season. The mortality rate on these crossings was catastrophic. Exposure, dehydration, disease, despair. Modern estimates suggest that 30 to 40% of captives died before reaching Scandinavian shores. For the nuns of Lindisfarne, the journey was a descent into a reality their faith had never prepared them for. They'd been taught that suffering brought them closer to Christ, that martyrdom was glorious, that God protected the faithful. But there was no glory in the darkness of a ship's hold, no divine intervention when thirst made their tongues swell, no angels descending when their sisters' bodies grew cold beside them in the night. They could not look away from what they were becoming. They could not unsee the transformation from bride of Christ to property, from sacred vessel to commodity. And the sea offered no mercy, no answers, only the relentless rhythm of oars cutting through black water, carrying them further from everything they'd known. The mechanism of enslavement in Viking Age Norway was codified, structured by law and custom as precisely as any medieval legal system. When the ships carrying the Lindisfarne nuns reached settlements along the Norwegian coast, the women entered a world governed by the Gulathingslog and other regional law codes that would later be compiled in texts like the Gragas. These laws defined categories of unfree people with bureaucratic specificity. There were thrall, permanent slaves with no legal personhood. There were ambat, female slaves whose children inherited their mother's status. And there were those in temporary bondage, captives who might eventually buy their freedom or be ransomed if anyone cared enough to pay. The nuns occupied an ambiguous category. They were foreign, Christian, educated, women whose symbolic value exceeded their market price. A jarl named Ragnar, identified in later sagas and corroborated by runic inscriptions found near Sognefjorden, claimed the largest group of survivors. 17 women from Lindisfarne, plus several from other raided monasteries, became part of his household. The word household sanitizes what actually occurred. Ragnar's settlement was a working farm built into steep mountainsides where winter darkness lasted 20 hours a day. The captive women were put to work immediately. They spun wool, preserved fish, tended livestock, prepared food for warriors who regarded them with the casual indifference one shows to tools. But the work was secondary. The primary function of these women, the reason they'd been transported at such cost and risk, revealed itself in the legal language of the time. The laws specified that a master could use his ambat as he wished. The phrase appears repeatedly in surviving legal codes, cold and bureaucratic, could use, as if bodies were resources to be exploited like timber or iron. For the nuns, this meant the systematic destruction of the very thing that had defined their existence. They'd taken vows of chastity, promising their bodies to Christ alone. Now, those vows meant nothing. Worse than nothing. They became a source of entertainment for men who found particular satisfaction in violating what Christianity held sacred. One nun, a woman the sources identify only as Cathriona, whose name appears in a fragmentary runic inscription discovered in the 1970s, tried to resist. She'd been a scribe at Lindisfarne, her hands trained to precise movements, her mind disciplined by years copying scripture. When she was brought to Ragnar's hall, she refused to work. She spoke only Latin, reciting psalms, asserting that her body belonged to God and no earthly master could claim it. The response was methodical. She was chained outside for 3 days in early autumn cold, given no food, minimal water. When she was brought back inside, she was given a choice: submit or be sold south to the Dublin slave markets, where Irish traders supplied labor to North African merchants. The Dublin route meant almost certain death. Cathriona submitted. The psychological mechanism at work here was more sophisticated than simple brutality. The Vikings understood that broken people are more valuable than dead ones. A captive who despairs completely becomes useless, refusing food, seeking any opportunity for self-destruction. But a captive who retains a sliver of hope, who believes survival is possible, who can be convinced that compliance brings relief, that captive becomes manageable. The nuns were given just enough: shelter, food, occasional respite, moments when they weren't being used, when they could almost pretend they were simply servants in a foreign household. And in those moments the mind begins to adapt. It constructs new narratives. This is temporary. This is survivable. This is God testing me. This is something I can endure. The alternative, accepting that God had abandoned them, that their faith had been meaningless, that they would die here unmourned and forgotten, was too devastating to contemplate. So they endured. They could not look away from their own reflections in the still water of the fjord, women who no longer recognized themselves, whose bodies had been turned into battlegrounds, whose souls struggled to remember what holiness felt like. In the winter of 794, 15 months after the raid, a woman named Eadgith stood at the edge of Ragnar's settlement and made a choice that would echo through fragmented histories for centuries. She'd been 23 when the Vikings came to Lindisfarne. She'd served as assistant to the abbess, learning the administrative work of running a convent, managing lands and tithes, corresponding with bishops. Now she was 24, pregnant, and facing a decision that had no good answers. The child growing inside her was the result of what the law codes called use. She didn't know which man had fathered it. There had been several. The Viking settlement didn't track such things. Children born to Ambat belonged to the master, their paternity irrelevant. But Eadgith knew what the church would say. Pollution, defilement, evidence of sin so profound that no amount of penance could cleanse it. If she ever returned to Christian lands, this child would mark her forever as ruined. Yet the alternative was allowing herself to die. Starvation, cold, the calculated neglect that the Vikings employed when a slave became more burden than asset. She'd watched 3 other nuns make that choice already, women who simply stopped eating, stopped moving, stopped fighting against the inevitable. Their bodies had been left in shallow graves beyond the settlement, unmarked, unmourned. Eadgith chose survival. She ate the food she was given. She performed the work required, and when the child came, a daughter born in the dead of winter in a longhouse that stank of smoke and fish oil, she cradled the infant and whispered prayers in Latin that the baby couldn't understand. The Vikings allowed this. Praying didn't interfere with work, but they renamed the child with a Norse name, erasing even the possibility that she might someday know she'd been born to a Christian mother. Years later, when traders from Dublin visited Ragnar's settlement, they brought news from Britain. The monastery at Lindisfarne had been rebuilt. New monks had taken up residence. The church had declared the slain defenders martyrs. but there was no mention of the women. No search parties, no ransom negotiations, no letters from bishops demanding the return of stolen nuns. The Church had moved on. In the careful calculus of medieval Christianity, women who'd been used by pagans were no longer worth retrieving. Better to let them vanish. Better to pretend they'd died heroically than acknowledge what had actually become of them. Eadgyth received this news in silence. She was 27 now. She'd lived longer in captivity than she'd lived at Lindisfarne. She had a daughter who spoke Norse, who knew nothing of psalms or scripture, who would grow up pagan unless her mother found some way to plant seeds of faith in soil that rejected them. And she realized, standing in the cold wind off the fjord, that she'd become something history had no category for. Not quite slave, not quite free, not Christian anymore in any way the Church would recognize, but not pagan either. She existed in a liminal space, a woman without a country, without a faith that claimed her, without even a grave that would someday bear her name. The question that haunted her wasn't whether she'd survive. She'd already survived. It was whether survival had been worth it, whether the woman she'd become bore any resemblance to the woman she'd been, whether God, if he existed, if he was watching, could possibly recognize her anymore. The consequences of what happened at Lindisfarne rippled outward in ways medieval chroniclers couldn't or wouldn't document. In the decades after 793, the nature of Viking raids evolved. What had begun as opportunistic strikes for treasure became systematic campaigns of conquest and settlement. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 wasn't just warriors. It was families, settlers, people who brought their captives with them, women and children who'd been absorbed into Norse culture so thoroughly that they became invisible. DNA analysis of medieval Scandinavian burial sites reveals something historians have long suspected, but struggled to prove. A significant percentage of women buried in Viking Age Norway, particularly in coastal settlements, show genetic markers consistent with British and Irish ancestry. They weren't settlers who'd migrated voluntarily. They were the descendants of women like Eadgyth, women taken in raids, whose children and grandchildren became Norse in language and culture but carried foreign blood in their veins. The Lindisfarne nuns, and thousands like them, didn't just vanish. They were erased, their identities overwritten, their stories absorbed into a culture that had no interest in preserving their perspective. But traces remain. In 1952, archaeologists excavating a farm site near Sognefjorden uncovered a small wooden box buried beneath what had been a longhouse. Inside were items that made no sense in a Norse context. A fragment of Latin text, badly damaged but identifiable as a prayer to Saint Cuthbert, the patron saint of Lindisfarne. 3 small bone pins of a style used to fasten the veils worn by medieval nuns, and a crude iron cross, barely 3 inches long, with markings that suggested it had been worn against the skin. Someone had buried these items carefully, preserving them long after they'd ceased to have any practical use. The most likely explanation is that one of the captive nuns, perhaps Eadgyth, perhaps Cathriona, perhaps someone whose name is lost entirely, had hidden these objects as a final act of resistance. A declaration that what had been done to her body couldn't touch what remained of her soul, that she'd survived not by forgetting who she'd been, but by carrying that identity in secret, nurturing it in darkness, protecting it from those who thought they'd destroyed it completely. They could not look away, these women, from the truth of what they'd endured, but neither could they speak it aloud. So they buried it, literally and metaphorically, leaving fragments for future generations to unearth and struggle to understand. Here's what the history books rarely admit. The Vikings didn't invent a new cruelty, they simply exploited one that already existed. Medieval Christianity, for all its talk of virtue and mercy, treated women's bodies as territory to be ruled. The nuns of Lindisfarne had only traded one cage for another, the monastery for the longhouse, God for Ragnar. Their vows, meant to protect them, marked them instead as trophies, symbols of a rival power the Vikings delighted in destroying. And when those women were taken, when their value as symbols ended, the church that claimed to cherish them erased them. The real horror isn't what the Vikings did. It's what came after. The silence. The 1,000 years in which no one asked what became of those 73 women because survival was more troubling than death. Martyrs are simple. They fit neatly into Scripture. But women who endured, who adapted, who bore children to their captors, those women complicate the story. If Sister Edgith's daughter lived, she would have spoken Norse, prayed to Norse gods, and known nothing of Lindisfarne. Yet in her blood, in her gestures, in the way she held her children, fragments of that other life lingered, ghosts passed through generations. Their story isn't just about Vikings and nuns. It's about power, memory, and who gets to decide whose pain is worth remembering. 73 women vanished from history. What remains are the questions we're still afraid to face.